Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Carmine's Arena, a cultural gourmet of information, if you will, a feast for your mind and soul. And now, without further delay, the man, the myth, the maestro, Carmine Arena.
Greetings and welcome once again to Carmine's Arena, site of contest and conflict, venue for and of resolution. Resolution in terms of focus, remedy, and commitment, both yours and mine, to the preservation, the propagation, and indeed the celebration of Western civilization. This episode number 120, is entitled The Art of Communication. I invite you to do yourself a favor and grab hold of a book by Lincoln Barnett called The Treasure of Our Tongue, subtitled The Story of the English Language from its Obscure Beginning to its Present Eminence as the Most Widely Spoken Language the World Over. There are the figures and a heap of statistics to support this claim, going all the way back to the 1960s when U.S. government installations were besieged by requests for instruction in our tongue, and even communist Russia and communist Chinese sources offered propaganda broadcasts in English to countries where no other language is more generally understood. In fact, quite ironically, British rule of India led to the entirety of the country becoming familiar with English usage, whilst before that India was a vast territory and a jumble of divisions and a jumble of languages and countless dialects. Consequently, common English usage unified the subcontinent to the extent that anti-colonial occupation of the country became focused and effective and led to British withdrawal and the reluctant end of its rule, all thanks to communication. Barnett, in his classic book about our language, packs it full with information about English etymology by way of history, geography, religion, politics, anthropology, and literature. There is also to be found in The Treasure of Our Tongue an unforgettable chapter on Shakespeare. Importantly, this book is nonetheless written in a manner that the average reader can understand and get quickly to the core of Lincoln Barnett's graceful erudition and linguistic mastery with little trouble or muddle. I quite personally take great pride in my language because it possesses innately the expressions that capture the human longing for freedom with a clarion clarity that is Shakespearean by inference, Jeffersonian by intent. I love language and foreign languages too, each with its own idiomatic understandings and emphasis. I love language each with its own perspectives and vision, each with its own expression, subtleties, and fine-tuned distinctions, and each ultimately codified into the highest form of organization of sound we call music. Yes, music, the ultimate means to shape the invisible, otherwise locked away in our hearts, minds, and souls, until only set forth unbound by the throbbing genius of melody, harmony, counterpoint, rhythm, pulse, dynamics, and texture. And yes, so much else that in its vibes we find the release for celebration and exaltation of God, the very maker of love itself. Well now, isn't it also wonderful to be human? As such, isn't it awful to make of ourselves anything less? Whenever I find myself misbehaving instead of being, I'm fortunately checked by my obedience to beauty. In the event you think these statements highfalutin, tune into your own four-legged pet, whose messaging of loyalty and vigilance on your behalf is built in, and I suspect, of godly origin. Certainly not Darwin's, nor Bill Maher's toxic noggins. In my early training as a classical pianist, I was lucky to find myself a child beloved by two parents, a mom and a dad. The condition always one's personal miracle, but now a questionable rarity, lost in liberation that ultimately enslaves, an arrogance that self-engraves sans brainwaves. But unlike all too many other times, this time about single parenthood I shall not thereupon rant, nor rave, nor us begrime of gender-neutral portrayal. I was, as a child, surrounded by the comforting companionship of my books and scores. You know, those bound glories which grant knowledge instead of Google, which merely imparts information. My mom read to me. She sat with open book in hand in a living room armchair, while her son sprawled on the rug or lengthwise on the sofa opposite, with head resting on a pillow among other cushy mates my mom made and ornamented with needlepoint. Till this day, I deeply enjoy being read to and confess that I've been fortunate in encountering a goodly number of unsummoned volunteers who were and are excellent readers. Readers who realize how to actualize the beauty of literature read aloud as poetry. As poetry, too, must always be recited aloud, even when, perhaps especially when, alone. Otherwise, like music which it resembles, it would not be sounded but merely remain mute, as notated in an unspoken score, kept in a closet, unperformed, unsung, deformed, you sadly uninformed. Codified way back in the Middle Ages were to be found the humanities, the 7 liberal, lively arts. The higher division of the 7 liberal arts being the quadrivium, consisting of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Yes, music. The lower division of the 7 was the trivium, consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Lest we forget, as we seem to have forgotten with zest, the knowledge and lifelong pursuit of these 7 seductive arts is what gives us the mind, the body, and soul of what too often is called human, but, in their absence, fails to become being human, but merely traits of subprimates. This has little to do with schooling, which today is a contaminated containment center. Therefore, schooling in the end must never be allowed to get in the way of education. For the ignorance of the learned is ripe with attitude, trumping aptitude, and ever to be the cause of our inquietude. Shakespeare never went to any university. In fact, he never went beyond grammar school. But what was once grammar school surpasses the basket-weaving courses hyped in today's computerized college precincts, low in man's higher instincts, highest in cyber interlinks. My own mother reluctantly left school in the 8th grade, left to go to work to sustain white privilege. You know that term that is a substitute for the black magic of victimhood a la medicine man Al Sharpton and company. Yet, as I've said, my mom willed herself literate, narrated to me all of Dickens' output, and to that date, way back then, read to me all the works of John Steinbeck, memorably The Grapes of Wrath. That work taught us how lucky we were with a different privilege in mind. Aside from my ever-heightening passion for the King's English and our American lingo, when it is left undiminished, there lies behind Shakespeare and, say, Herman Melville, the consummate mastery of rhetoric. You will recall that was part of the trivium, consisting of grammar, logic, and yes, rhetoric, which to language and music is quite strategic. Allow me to sharpen the very definition of what is meant by rhetoric, spelled R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. Rhetoric is the means of effective advocacy in prose and poetry. It is the very codification of verbal strategies that enhance the reception of a text or an oration, especially oration. Likewise, in music, rhetoric is the conscious, consistent use of patterns and formal arrangements to engender in an audience a sense of aesthetic satisfaction or psychological plausibility that clarifies or heightens the intended effect of a composition or performance, quite literally giving words talk, T-O-R-Q-U-E. Forgive the pun. Thus, clarity of communication, all too absent these days in computer speak, which abbreviates for speed and deficient efficiency, resulting in frequent confrontation with misleading abbreviation. For example, education was reduced to ED, which today can also stand for erectile dysfunction. Think about it. You won't run out of amusing material anytime soon. Seriously, however, so important are these verbal strategies found in the study of rhetoric that they hearken back to the Greek Aristotle and to the Roman Cicero and his influential countryman Quintilian. These latter linguistic giants have furnished much of the basic vocabulary of critical analysis used in succeeding ages, right up to the here and now. Generally, rhetoric is divided into 5 parts: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery, because ancient music theory was allied chiefly with speculative philosophy and mathematics. It is not surprising that early writings on rhetoric usually mention music in the context of delivery. As time elapsed, music began to be mentioned in relation to arrangement and style as well. During the Baroque era, the period culminating with the great J.S. Bach, a full-fledged doctrine of musical rhetoric would include analogues for all 5 parts in virtually every procedure of classical rhetoric. You will recall these 5 parts again are invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. These last features were particularly to be respected by the likes of clergy in their weekly sermons and occasional orations. Bach's organ music and chorales, which preceded and followed these sermons, were also expected to adhere to said rhetorical principles of advocacy and persuasion. Starting a sentence with one constantly hears these days, "I mean," or "you know what I mean," would have been considered moronic, maybe imbecilic, or perhaps even idiotic. Phrasing reduced to goo-goo gurgling and well-deserving of our hazing. Thus, for clergy or composers, rhetoric was elevated to a central role in the crafts of godly expression. In the case of music, music had become so rich and expressive at patterns that this serendipitous union with rhetoric emerged a mandate, an aesthetic imperative. The composer's study, therefore, of grammar, rhetoric, and poetry had to be fully engaged, for without knowledge of these studies, one sets to work almost to no avail, and, so to speak, sets to work with dirty hands. Again, one must always account for Johann Sebastian Bach, whose dates are 1685 through 1750, yet is as contemporaneous as tomorrow, and yet tomorrow. For example, his astounding masterpiece entitled Musical Offering is a composition of 13 sections, all based on a theme invented by Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was a trained musician himself and was honored to meet Bach visiting his court. It is perhaps the most perfect realization of the rhetorical formal ideal in all of music. For further in-depth understanding of this work, one must read the brilliant analysis of Ursula Kirkendale, written in 1980, Why Even Bach's Latin dedication of the work to the king engages astute wordplay that is associated to the work's interior musical form, and is itself an acrostic which remains nothing short of verbally dazzling. And that's before you even get to hear the glorious music. You see, advocacy and persuasion was everything in communicating meaning, affect, or mood. Unlike today, when even the learned are sloppy in the usage of language, hardly able to utter, let alone write, a simple declarative sentence without nonsensical filler words like actually, and or basically, employed motorically and expressing delight, for example, with the phrase, "It was so fun." That crazed phrase should be tased. This seedy poverty, which beggars language, also squanders the merits of political exchange, which are grossly at a remove from even the adequacy of meanings. Ironically, these distortions constitute the sick puppy syndrome of political correctness, which barks when the door to truth is open, even a crack, begging not to go out. Moving along, I strongly advise that you read aloud Mark Antony's oration at Caesar's funeral. This is a virtuoso Shakespearean masterpiece of advocacy and persuasion that follows all the rules of public speaking set forth by the aforementioned Roman Quintilian. Quintilian, whom he studied, remember, in grammar school when he dropped out at 13 years of age. Also, brush up your language skills by reading aloud Shakespeare's soliloquies, where we are made to overhear a character's stream of conscience. You'll never fetch from out the chop cuts of text speak, as empty of accurate meaning any more than selfhood is reflected in harum-scarum selfies, those giddy dum-dum effigies. Instead, lend Shakespeare your ears to learn how our judgment hath fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Modern-day language made a burden when once beholden to much that was silken, not group think herded. My mother and I, long after a well-read book was closed and shelved, would continue to speculate on the lives of the characters and what they were doing at that very moment. Thanks to great, precise, and detailed authors, we came to know these cast of characters better than we knew our next-door neighbors or relatives. In that regard, we could never encounter on such an intimate basis in one lifetime the thousands of characters and personalities we otherwise befriend in book after book after book. Reading is as important as prayer, as important as meaning, important as beauty, important as love, important as sensing and later learning how and why and yes, where we get to fit into the scheme that subsumes the best that's supreme. Yes, in the absence of rhetoric's arts, we become intellect's heretics, language's loan sharks. And yes, allow me one other tribute to the realization of the rhetorical richness of language. That tribute goes to Ralph Ellison, a black writer who created the masterpiece which stands alone and aloft on a pinnacle. That masterpiece is entitled The Invisible Man. The work's interiority, its profound meanings, are utterly inexhaustible. Using, for example, verbal jazz riffs of inventive language whose very delivery, memory, and style of advocacy and persuasion makes the black struggles volatilely vibrant, and yet at the same time measures and mocks with incomparable mimicry the dynamics and philippics of race-hustling clergy, engaged in the sacrilege of self-aggrandizement, in perpetuity of perversity, infidelity, and damaged dignity. An inexcusable personal insult to Ralph Ellison's massive integrity. Unto this very day, by said turgid clergy, who slather white guilt like plaster in the halls of learning. Yes, for many reasons, the invisible man is biblical and should be read from cover to cover, again and again, yearly. Remember The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. You are in the presence of a man with massive dignity. Till next time, my friends, as always, keep the faith, remembering that language and the seven arts were given us as a tool to wipe away the dribbles and drool of untruthful fools. Press 1 for finishing school, and here's hoping to see you soon, and into rhetoric continue to zoom. Ciao.
If you have any comments or other remarks, and that I perhaps could even read on some of these broadcasts, please do not hesitate to write to me, Carmine Arena, P.O. Box 1029, Larchmont, New York 10538.